Hey guys, welcome to Boxing Squad for boxing news and views from around the internet. Just who should Dillian Whyte fight next? That's what I want to talk about in this video because he could be waiting a long time before his shot against the WBC belt holder, which is currently Deontay Wilder. So through his win over Oscar Rivas at the weekend, Dillian Whyte picked up the WBC mandatory challenger position. So he's guaranteed a title shot. But when that shot will be, anyone's guess, because at the moment Deontay Wilder has potentially two fights booked up. We're talking Luis Ortiz in November 2019 and then potentially a rematch with Tyson Fury in early 2020. Eddie Hearn, Whyte's promoter, has been sort of quite strident in his public statement, saying the WBC needs to ensure that Dillian Whyte has his title shot before May 18, 2020, and part of that is based on Wilder's last mandatory was May 18, 2019. So Hearn is of the rationale that Wilder needs to complete his mandatory obligations once every year. But the WBC has only made Deontay Wilder fight two mandatory challenges in, 4.5 years, so I don't have any confidence that the WBC will bend to Eddie Hearn's will, and to this point, they haven't. They've given this token opportunity of the mandatory challenger position for this point, but they know that Deontay Wilder has other fights that are going on. So for the minute, Deontay Wilder is going to be doing other things, and Whyte, courtesy of his win over Deontay Wilder, is the mandatory challenger and also the WBC interim title holder. So he's got a title of some sorts. We'll have to see what do the other sanctioning bodies do here. Do they recognize this as a full-blown title, similar to the WBA regular title? We'll see what happens. But at the moment, Dillian Whyte has got some choices to make because he knows he's going to be waiting. He won't want to just be inactive until he gets that title shot. Because realistically, I don't think they can force Deontay Wilder and Dillian Whyte to fight before May 18, 2020. It's just unrealistic in my view. The earliest Whyte is likely to get his shot is the back end of 2020. Whoever the belt holder is at that point is unclear. Nothing is ever guaranteed in the heavyweight division. And Deontay Wilder could well lose to either Luis Ortiz, or even if he beats him, he could lose to Tyson Fury. So Whyte, though, he's got some decisions to make. Probably he's going to need to have at least two fights ahead of his title shot. But at a bare minimum, it would be at least one. He won't want to just sit on this mandatory shot and not take any fights because that would not serve him well ahead of a title shot with whoever the belt holder is. Inactivity can be a killer. So Whyte likely has to choose another opponent for a pay-per-view event in the UK for, December this year? Potentially maybe even a little sooner. We will have to see what they want to do there. Dillian Whyte has been fighting 3 times a year generally, so fighting twice a year, maybe that's not going to be his cup of tea, but at least one more fight in 2020. And when you consider the options about what would be acceptable for an opponent, there's actually not that many options available, because it can't just be anyone. If it's going to be on pay-per-view, and it would, because Dillian Whyte is now a pay-per-view fighter, and with Anthony Joshua having been away in the US, Sky is relying on Eddie Hearn to be putting Dillian Whyte into good pay-per-view fights, because Sky will want to clip the ticket and earn bank off Dillian Whyte and his efforts. That's part of the reason they do it, is to make money, plain and simple. So we have to expect it's going to be a decent opponent. And he just fought Oscar Rivas, who was a legitimate top 15 contender. So it has to be someone at least roughly in the same ballpark. You wouldn't want to go too much lower than the top 15, maybe the top 20 at a push, but it needs to be someone with some credit behind them, a bit of a resume, and someone that you can sort of sell to the masses, because ultimately that's what pay-per-view is about. And we did see with Oscar Rivas and the choice of this opponent that perhaps it did backfire a little in terms of the ticket selling situation. We don't know what the pay-per-view numbers are at this point. But they sold less than potentially they otherwise would, had it been someone who had spoken English and been able to, sell the promotion, but someone who was also maybe a bit of a name, because Oscar Rivas didn't have a big fan base. He didn't contribute to the promotion in a sort of trash-talking sort of sense. There weren't many quotes in terms of the English-speaking media, that sort of thing. All of that does help build buzz and hype for a fight. And I think they said that there was going to be a maximum, this is Eddie Hearn, of about 14,000 people in the O2. Previously, he'd fought guys with a bigger profile and maybe a bit more star power too, in Joseph Parker and also Derek Chisora. There were many more tickets sold for those two fights. And also the pay-per-view numbers, from what we understand, were relatively healthy for both of those fights. Somewhere between, about 400, 450,000 in the ballpark there. We'll have to see what happens here with this Rivas fight, but that was, in my view, a pay-per-view worthy card. I paid for it here back in New Zealand when they charged me $35 for it, but there was a lot of good heavyweight fights, so I was always going to get that card. But I think it needs to be an opponent that people can look at and go, oh yeah, that's a very credible opponent, because you can't just pluck anyone out and expect it to do well. Dillian Whyte is not a big enough star to just pluck out a Tom Schwartz, for example, and expect that to go well and for people to accept it. So, of the options, I've been going through some of the names that could be possibles, and just going off the list of names on BoxRec, going through about the top 20, there's a few options there, but it's a bit threadbare, and you potentially have to go a little bit further down to actually get another name or two that could be in the mix. But I think the clear contender for Dillian Whyte would be Alexander Povetkin. Currently rated 5th on BoxRec, ahead of Whyte. Alexander Povetkin is a top 10 fighter, still at this point at his late in his career. He's 39 years old, soon to be 40, but he's still a very good fighter. His last fight was against Anthony Joshua, the back end of 2018. He has not fought so far in 2019. He was going to be fighting a couple of different dates, but things never really came together. There was talk about Michael Hunter and Alexander Povetkin almost fighting, never got made. Talk about Alexander Povetkin going to be fighting in Saudi Arabia, that fell through. There was talk about him fighting at the end of this month on a card in the United States, but for whatever reason that hasn't happened. So it will be interesting to see what happens with Povetkin next, because he will also want to be in a meaningful fight. He won't just want to be facing nobodies for the rest of his career. He only has a couple of fights potentially left in him. He did actually run through a full camp recently because there were some fighters that were in that camp. One of them that I spoke to was Vladislav Serenko, and he confirmed he was in Povetkin's camp, but ultimately whatever Povetkin was training for didn't seem to materialize. So Alexander Povetkin is a top 10 fighter. He would still give enough credit, and he's a big enough name that Dillian Whyte could get some credit for beating him. And I think you could sell that event. Povetkin doesn't really speak English, and he, like Rivas, he doesn't really get into things with the media through the build-up. But he's a much bigger star in terms of the heavyweight division and profile. So I think just on the strength of his name, his resume, and what he's done in the heavyweight division, Povetkin to me is the standout option. And maybe he will be interested in that fight, because outside of Dillian Whyte, what are really the other options for Alexander Povetkin right now? It's a bit hard to see who he would face. So if they were inclined to make that matchup, I think that's the best available. Because you go down the list here, and one name that sort of maybe sticks out as a possible, but I think it's rather improbable, is Jarrell Miller. As we know, he failed 3 different doping tests ahead of a scheduled fight with Anthony Joshua. He's currently dropped from the rankings by the WBA. He was dropped by the WBO as well, the only 2 rankings that he did have, because one, he wouldn't sign up to the WBC clean boxing program, which does look suspicious in hindsight, and also he was dropped from the IBF rankings for failing to face Kubrat Pulev last year. So Miller, is it too soon? Because effectively everyone is sort of saying, with a 6-month ban from the WBA, effectively dropping him out of the rankings, requiring him to do VADA testing, that it was a bit soft. And if he walked straight into a pay-per-view event with Dillian Whyte, effectively he only missed 1 fight, and it's not much of a punishment. And that's the same argument that people have been making for why Jarrell Miller should not be the opponent for Tyson Fury. So, yeah, I do think that Jarrell Miller, in terms of the build-up, the trash talk, how he would sell the fight, all of that ticks a lot of boxes, and I'm sure at this moment Jarrell Miller is a bit short on options compared to where he was ahead of those failed tests. But I'm just not sure it's going to happen. It's probably too soon. I don't think Eddie Hearn's rage is, sort of subsided enough for him to forgive that. But also, would Dillian Whyte want to be giving this guy a bone at this point? Not convinced. You go down the list here, I mean, there's other names like Kubrat Pulev, Joseph Parker. Parker would take that in a shot, but I don't see that rematch happening until Dillian Whyte loses, because he said he's already beaten Parker. He's got no reason to face a guy that he's already beat, even though he did rematch Derek Chisora. In terms of Pulev, yeah, I just can't see that happening. I think he's going to sit on his IBF mandatory status until he gets his shot at a title, which is likely to be early next year. And in terms of Pulev, sure, he's been taking the odd fight like the Bogdan Dinu one, but I think it will be at that level. I don't think it's going to be anyone that is really a huge risk to him, his status within the division and his title shot. Another possible name is Adam Kovnatsky, and I think that would be a really good fight. There would be some people who would back Kovnatsky in that fight, but I'm just not so sure with the different promotional stables that they're in if that is really going to work. And it feels like Adam Kovnatsky is also being sort of kept in reserve because he's in the PBC stable for him to be in line for a title shot at the WBC belt holder at some point in the next sort of 18 months or so. It just kind of feels like he was potentially in line quicker, but now he's sort of back in the queue, but he's still being in the queue, and I think they'll preserve him and his unbeaten record. That's probably the reason the Chris Arreola fight got made. It's another opportunity for Kovnatsky to impress against a guy who's not necessarily top caliber opposition anymore, but he can still get a little bit of credit and obviously potentially a decent looking stoppage. So we shall see what happens with Adam Kovnatsky, but Dillian Whyte and Adam Kovnatsky just don't see it at the moment. Going down the list, there's either a number of names who have either just coming off losses or guys that Whyte has already fought, like Derek Chisora. We don't need to see the third fight. Number 16, Gerald Washington. Yeah, just can't see that one. He's coming off a good win against a common opponent in Robert Helenius, but I just don't think it's enough. I just don't think with all the losses that Washington has had, Kovnatsky, Miller, Wilder, don't think that would be a viable pay-per-view opponent. There are some prospects down the bottom end of the top 20 of the BoxRec list, like Filip Hrgović and Joe Joyce, for example, but I just don't see those fights getting made. Joe Joyce probably in the wrong promotional stable at this point, but also Filip Hrgović, who is a Matchroom co-promoted fighter. I think they've got different plans for Hrgović in terms of when he would be positioned for a heavyweight title. Hrgović would probably fancy his chances against Whyte, but remember, Dillian Whyte is the sort of A side of that equation at this point. It's a very dangerous fight for him, dangerous fight for Hrgović too, but I think in terms of, is Hrgović a well-known enough name? Probably not. They look at these things as a business. They're trying to maximize profit and revenue. This is why those fights, especially with Joseph Parker and also Derek Chisora, got made in 2018, because those were the names that they thought they could make the most money off and get the biggest payday for Whyte, but also for Sky. Other names down here, yeah, I can't see too much that could really work, but another name that I was thinking of who was further down the BoxRec list, but is also got a little bit of buzz, a little bit of hype, and this is a guy who I mentioned earlier as a potential opponent for Alexander Povetkin, because there's talk that that fight may get made, Povetkin and Michael Hunter. But I think Michael Hunter and Dillian Whyte, I don't mind that fight actually. It would be quite a tricky fight for Dillian Whyte with the movement of Hunter. He is quite an awkward character, but he's sort of in a position in his career right now where he's not exactly a fully known quantity by the public. His best wins at heavyweight, Martin Bakole, that was an impressive win, but it was over a prospect. He battered Alexander Ustinov, but Ustinov was faded beyond belief. So he's still struggling, I think, in, perception-wise with fans, that is he really a legit force? I mean, it remains to be seen. I think that would be a very good fight, but, the optics of it may sort of somewhat maybe like the Rivas fight, because Rivas was an unknown quantity, didn't really resonate with casual fans in a ticketing sense. So it might be a similar situation with Hunter to some extent, although crucially I think for the promotion, if that fight was made, he speaks English and he's well spoken, so he could potentially help Whyte sell the fight much better than Rivas did. So I think at this point, Alexander Povetkin is the obvious choice for me. Maybe a dark horse would be Jarrell Miller, but does he deserve the opportunity? And maybe Michael Hunter is a guy that potentially could also be a dark horse too. He could be someone who could come into this and actually give Whyte a very good fight. Whyte could get some credit, and it's more than just to stay busy. It'd be a very challenging fight, but still a winnable fight for Whyte. What do you make of it all? Drop a comment, loud and often, hit like, hit subscribe, follow me on Twitter, boxing_squared. I'm out.